And so now what he does here is he moves from Hume, and he moves to the early 20th century, like in the 1920s and so forth, and to the what's been called the logical positivists or the logical empiricists, right? So these were a group of mainly German-speaking philosophers, and philosophically minded scientists, and they were then. They pick up on what Hume was doing in the mid 1700s, right?
Yeah, they're kind of like his apostles. They took his work and wanted to move it further down the road of what it was initially doing. So Hume was okay with separating the newfound science from philosophy and theology. The logical positives come in and kind of clean house and kind of have a litmus test of if you have any of these ideas of metaphysics or some type of theology, you need to be driven from the ivory tower so that we can establish this new order.
You're treading in meaningless gobbledygook, right?
Right.
So they band together, and their group, at least the most famous portion of these groups was called the Vienna Circle, right? Mm-hmm. And and it's interesting, they do move one would suggest they move philosophy down the road a bit, right? They invent, for all practical purposes, symbolic logic, right?
Yeah,
beginning with Frege.
I mean, you learn in still today in deductive logic classes and your syllogisms and all the fun little things that you have to do. But it's helpful because it helps to clarify, or it kind of puts a mathematical spin on language and tries to show through a representational letter logic process how argumentation is occurring. And so you can kind of see where you're making your mistakes without having to kind of look at the argumentation. You're just concerned with
the
representation.
form and the structure of the argument. Yeah. So you can look at the form and structure. You can outline the form and structure symbolically, right? And then that'll tell you whether or not you have we might say a valid argument, right?
Which, if you like algebra and then philosophy, that's the way to go. So I really took it to heart once I found a book that, in fact, that you had. I had thrown out the book that I was supposed to learn from, and I used your book. But that's the one that I liked, and I was like, oh, this is just algebra with philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the pairing of two geeky things for me. That was great.
So, and so that's where the logical positivists got us, right? They got us to this symbolic logic, and they suggested that they realized that they were in a situation not unlike Hume, right? Their discontent with philosophy, Stokes tells us, was indeed a major factor in the scientific revolution that happened around that time. Now, also, there were lots of things going on. We're talking about Einstein's theory of general relativity, and all that kind of stuff was beginning to, we might say, blow up.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, almost literally.
Yeah. And quantum mechanics and that sort of thing. Yeah. Right?
You were going from a Newtonian understanding to a little bit later than probably the 20s, 30s, but you had kind of the understanding of what an atom was, and the whole Einstein versus Bohr kind of rivalry would probably put it. It was kind of the interesting time of science, because then you had kind of the powerhouses trying to outdo each other, and you had your camps and stuff like that. And I don't think you really have that these days, but that was the boxing matches before Hitler divided the world, and we didn't hear from Germany until way later.
Until a little later, yeah. All right. But he says here, a significant part of the problem with philosophy, said the logical positivists, was that philosophers had been bewitched by language, right? That was the issue, language. And he says that he's mentioned earlier, and we're now in a place where we can see that philosophers said the logical positivists had become preoccupied with problems that weren't problems at all. They were pseudo problems, right? And so they were looking They were the things that philosophers, especially metaphysicians, were involved in weren't really problems at all. They were playing games with language, and so the logical positivists wanted to move in with this clarifying logical approach, right, to help wade through all of this playing games with language that they thought the metaphysicians were doing. In fact, he gives us what he calls one of the most notorious cases is from Heidegger's "What is Metaphysics?" And of course, we gotta at least quote a portion of this so that folks understand. This is the kind of things that the logical positivists railed against, cringed when they heard it, right? Became angry and banging their fist on the ground.
What do you mean? What are you talking about? So this is an interesting quote. It's what is to be investigated is being only and nothing else, being alone and further nothing, solely being, and beyond being nothing. What about this nothing? Does the nothing exist only because the not, i.e. the negation, exists? Or is it the other way around? Does negation and the not exist because the nothing exists? And it goes on further and says things like, indeed, the nothing itself as such was present. What about this nothing? The nothing itself, nothings.
There you go. So let's talk about nothing.
Very clear.
Yeah. And what is nothing? And what do we mean by nothing? And well, the nothing itself is nothing. All right. So now we have some knowledge.
We have something? Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because Krauss is kind of one of these people that we looked at 2 episodes ago, where he also wants to talk about nothing, but when he says nothing, he does mean something. Right. So it seems like we've gone back the other direction, where pretty soon it's going to be the Christians that are going to be burning nothing in effigy. It's right. You can read this quote and see where these people were getting frustrated at when you're having this discussion where you're having to pull in fifth negations in sentences in order to understand, when they have this structure that they're trying to implement that has, a logic, a mathematical feel to it, that they're trying to derive information. They're not trying to woo the crowd with tricks of phrases or getting lost in, where everything is at. They're putting an end to even that, and again, creating these like the syllogisms and stuff like that. Really trying to bring in a mathematical, logical approach that kind of slows the language portion of it and brings more of the science factor into.
Yeah, so that's really, the idea here is that philosophy was, as Mitch Stokes tells us, was trucking in meaningless language, right? The obvious cure, said the logical positivists, was to use something like Hume's fork, his criteria of meaning. They said that a statement is meaningful if it had 2 particular ways, similar to what Hume said, right? If number 1, it can be empirically checked or verified. Can we check it? Can we check the statement against our experience, our empirical experience, right? Or verify it, and that there's an existence of it in the world. And secondly, so empirical verification or empirically checked. And secondly, it's a matter of definition or analytic, right? So these 2 conditions correspond to Hume's matters of fact and relation of ideas. The first condition underwrites science, empirical verification, while the second, he tells us, licenses mathematics and logic, right? That is a matter of definition or analytic.
Right. So, saying something that the car cannot be both on the street and in the garage would be a logical statement that gets you the non-contradiction, law of non-contradiction. But you're not playing with the words of, well, the car has this state of being where it could be in the garage, but then we know that nothing is outside the garage with the car, and so you're not getting into this kind of trope of saying a bunch of useless complication gobbledygook, because it's essentially what they call it,
right?
Where it's just a straightforward, this is the logical law that we're applying to, or the mathematical law, or a definition of terms. So you don't have to talk about all the things that the circle isn't. You can say the circle has no sides, and continue to clarify, what the definition of a circle is. So.
Right. So these two notions then are the empirical verification and the idea of matters of definition are then what they say helps us to eliminate the meaninglessness with regard to language, especially in metaphysics and theology, by the way.